PlayStation 2 is currently the best-selling console of all time and a classic to many who grew up in the 2000s. While it may be tempting to grab one from eBay to relive your childhood, you'll need to set a realistic expectation. After all, it is a 20-year-old console. So let's talk about the pros and cons of buying a PS2 now. PS2 has gone through many hardware revisions over the years. The version I grew up with was the Slim PS2. It was amazing back then, how much they managed to slim down from the original. And still is jaw-dropping. As a tech enthusiast, just looking at PS2 gives me such an awe of how incredible of a hardware it is. So small, it is not that much bigger than a Switch. Comparing it to PS5 or Xbox is hilarious. It's like a lost art form of miniaturization. Sometimes, owning multiple consoles can feel a bit excessive, but with something this small, it's not too bad. It also brings a heaping tablespoon of nostalgia. PS2 Slim was one of my first consoles as a kid, and the fact that years later I have a PS2 Slim in my possession again brings me such joy. I don't even need to play it. Just owning the device puts a smile on my face. As games became more expensive to develop, they have become somewhat safe. They rely on tested formulas and rarely stray away from it, which is why the PS2 catalog is absolutely wild and refreshing. All kinds of ideas were turned into games during this era, from the classics to games based on movies and TV shows, and random madness. Now tell me, do you think this game can be made now? The sheer variety of titles on PS2 is a good enough reason to buy this console. It's so affordable. After all, it is the best-selling console of all time, meaning there are millions of units out in the wild. Everyone had a PS2, and games were sold for decades. Most titles can be had for low prices, especially if you don't care about manuals or conditions. You'll also come across a bundle deal of a console and dozens of games. Not all games will be your cup of tea, but maybe you can use this opportunity to try out games that you may not even glance at. If you want to play game backups, there are many different ways that can be achieved. You can play games off the hard drive, via USB drive, network, or burn your own disk without any hardware modification. I burn my own disk as it works out to be the cheapest for me. This also kind of circumvents region locking. One of the reasons why I bought a PS2 was to play RPGs like Dragon Quest, Xenogears, and Xenosaga. Unfortunately, there's no soft mod that lets you run a game disc from another region. But if you were to run the game using the methods I've previously mentioned, it runs just fine. Here's Dragon Quest VIII, a copy of the US version I own, burned to a DVD running on my Australian PS2 without any mods. You can even burn PS1 games, but due to hardware restrictions, it will run via emulation. All homebrew methods will have compatibility issues, as some games may exhibit glitches, and not all homebrew methods are compatible with every system. For example, the DVD method only works with select PS2 systems with a specific version of a DVD player firmware. So, if you're interested, do some research before jumping in. The unfortunate reality of PS2 is that it looks terrible. Some of it due to age, but not all of it. You see, PS2 games were designed with CRT TVs in mind. This is something I've gone through in my previous video, where games from the CRT era look vastly different depending on what kind of television you use. Flat screen TVs did exist back then. Here's one from the early 2000s. This is a PC monitor/TV, which was common back then, where they would take the LCD panel intended for a computer monitor and attached TV functionalities. It looks alright, but the TV itself is lacking in brightness and has severe input delays, rendering it useless. This scene from GTA San Andreas is completely indiscernible. So your best bet is to get CRT TVs, which aren't too expensive, but their size makes it impractical for most households. Or maybe you're like me, where you have lowered your expectations and are willing to use the television you already have at home. Which brings another issue. PS2 connects to TVs using component or composite cables. These are the colorful cables you may remember from your childhood. Many budget or mainstream televisions do not have these ports anymore. I got lucky with my televisions as they all have component ports, but chances are, it's highly unlikely for your TV to have these ports. Even if it does, the picture quality looks bad. I don't think modern televisions know how to handle 480i properly. I have two LG TVs, one with native component inputs and another with two ports that require adapters. Adapters I thought I would never need and chucked it somewhere in the house that I spent an entire day looking for. Using modern TV gives all the modern benefits like true black, good response time, and great color accuracy, but it's still a 480i signal blown up to the big screen. If you don't have component, you'll have to use this. This is an HDMI adapter for PS2. There are many versions of this out in the market for very low prices. They're okay, and if you don't have composite or component inputs, they will be your only option. You could also get yourself a RetroTink 4K, which can emulate the features of CRT on a modern television. It has a hefty price tag, but if you're a serious collector and own multiple retro systems, it may be worth it. Or you can avoid all these issues by emulating it on your PC. Just because you remember it on PS2 doesn't mean that game is only available on it. Many titles people associate with PS2 are either multi-platform or have already been ported, remastered, or remade in newer consoles. PS2 is not the only option to play these games. Here are some first-party titles people associate with PS2. They have all been ported to PS3 at higher resolution and frame rates. You wanna play God of War? Well, you can play every single God of War games before reboot on PS3. Same with many other titles. There are definitely some titles from both first and third-party developers that are stranded on PS2. But I believe most people buy PS2 to play these types of games like Ratchet & Clank or Sly Cooper. If you are, you may be better off with PS3 as it has native HDMI support. Some PS2 games are available digitally on the PS Store, and some PS3 consoles can even run physical PS2 games. That was every reason why you should or shouldn't buy a PS2. It's a lovely system that has a sentimental value for me. I love it, but I know its flaws too well. However, if you are interested in owning one, set a realistic expectation, as no matter what you do with it, it's still a 20+ year old console. Maybe it's not the console that matters, but the games. If you can play PS2 games on more accessible and modern platforms, that may be the way to go. That's it for now. Bye.